and 1.
Excellent. Welcome to Glasgow 2024 presents Addiction in SFF. Welcome to viewers on YouTube and guests coming in via Eventbrite. I'm going to do the code of conduct first, so the glasses go on for this because it's very important. So we have a zero tolerance policy on racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, etc. And anyone behaving inappropriately will be removed from the webinar. One strike and you're out. We have 2 modes of lodging questions when we get a bit further in. Maybe there's a Q&A function for webinar attendees, and also comments. If you raise comments on YouTube, they'll be passed over to the webinar, and we can tackle those a bit later on. So now I would like to, if you are live tweeting or tweeting about the panel, please use the hashtag Glasgow 2024 so we can retweet and pass things on. So I am very excited to welcome our panelists this evening to discuss this topic. What is the opium of the people these days? Maybe we'll find out. Is love the drug, as Roxy Music would have us believe? Should we say no to pipeweed? Well, we shall find out. I have an excellent series of guests here, number of guests here, and I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves, if they would please. Anna, would you please start?
Oh goodness. Hi, it's brilliant to be here. My name's Anna Smith-Spark. I'm the author of God Broken Knives, Tower of Living Dying, House of Sacrifice, and A Woman with a Sword, which I probably won't be talking about much today. I'm basically, so those are kind of grimdark, epic fantasy, a trilogy, and then a sort of standalone, which in the same world, written some short stories in that world. And I guess I'm probably here because one of the major characters in the trilogy has major substance abuse issues. That's me.
That may have been a factor.
That may have been a factor.
That may have been a factor. Yes.
The only thing I can talk about here, so let's hope it was a factor.
Oh, not at all. Jenny, would you care to introduce yourself, please?
Hi there. My name's Jenni Coutts, and I am a writer and artist. I work as an illustrator a lot of the time, so I should have brought props like Anna did. I've got a prop, hang on. I'm the current British Fantasy Award winner for Best Artist. In my day job, I am also a GP. So I can bring some medical experience here to try and talk about. So yeah, that's and I'm based in Glasgow as well.
Cool, excellent. Ollie, would you care to go next?
I can indeed. Hello. Yeah, Oliver K. Langmead, also published under Oliver Langmead, depending on which book it is. Author of various science fiction things, talk about glitterati and Darkstar today, probably. Some fantasy stuff as well, and I'm a lecturer in creative writing at Lancaster University.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ollie. And Stuart, please introduce yourself.
Hey there, I'm Stew Hotston. I'm a writer and critic of various kinds, lots of short stories out there and kind of a handful of novels to my name. Probably the most relevant here is a Tangles game where the worst boyfriend in the world is also absolutely a recovering drug addict.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. So just a little bit of the terms of reference. Addiction obviously is a fairly wide term. I propose not to discuss what might be described as legal highs like alcohol and tobacco and things like that. Technology is maybe a grey area. Maybe we touch on that, or maybe we don't. But I'm thinking much more of illicit substances or substances perhaps that are used in an immoral way by by, for example, despotic regimes or in social experiments to control populations. So that's more the sort of territory that I'm thinking of. So with that in mind, my first question is hopefully quite a general one. Obviously, there are within those terms of reference many examples of use of addictive substances, drugs in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And I just wanted to ask each of you what examples maybe stand out to you. Maybe pick one that you think's worth mentioning. Any volunteers to go first? I'm not going to necessarily point the finger at anyone in particular.
I'm going to be cheeky and go back a little bit and think about Jekyll and Hyde and the serum that Dr. Jekyll drinks to turn into Hyde that becomes addictive and then eventually transforms him into kind of permanently. And I think when I was thinking about this, I was you don't immediately think about drug addiction or drug abuse when you're thinking about classic novels like that, but it's right there. And I do think that the people reading it at the time would have been familiar with that kind of substance abuse. It would have been something they recognized. And I think it's something you could easily glide over now because you don't really think about it in those terms. But I think if you were to read it with kind of the eyes of the people who read it in a contemporaneous fashion, it would have been a standout for them that, oh yes, there's people around us who are taking these sorts of substances, and we've seen that sort of transformation in them, the way their behavior changes when they're on and off it. So yeah, that's a standout for me.
That's interesting. Yes. And it's a good point. And I'll be honest, I hadn't particularly thought of it in those terms when framing questions, but of course in Victorian times or longer ago, things were accepted that today would be viewed very differently. Like
there would have been there would absolutely have been an intervention in his life, I suspect.
Things like laudanum, and I'd had reason with something I was writing today to look up historical cigarette advertising. And I know I said we weren't going to talk about tobacco, but as an illustration of how the views of society have changed, we don't need to go all that far back, I suppose, to find some quite different attitudes. Any other exampbles anyone would care to throw out?
This is the one question I've been thinking about and prepared for, but it's one of the things that always stuck in my mind from being quite young was the first, we're reading Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy and the use of Hasia in the third volume, The Furthest Shore, and just that sense of sadness and that very sympathetic writing that she has about the people who are using Hasia. That Hasia root is it is very addictive. It is essentially it's sort of used rather like opium. And that she's it's not good. It's very it's not great. It's bad that these people are taking it. It's very sad. But there's a great sense of sympathy for why they're doing it, that the world is becoming very dark. Sort of society's crumbling. Things are not as they were. And people are trying to find ways of dealing with that. And one of the ways that they're dealing with that is by using drugs to try and find some kind of relief. Things are failing, crops are failing, people are losing their skills. They're kind of becoming drug addicts in a very, very in a way that's very nuanced and shown as being, it's calamitous for the society and it's calamitous for them, but you also have a deep sense of sympathy for them. It's beautifully written. I remember it very, very clearly because as a child, it was one of the first books I read which actually sort of talked about these things quite kind of openly, but in a very kind of sympathetic way rather than just a kind of condemnatory way, or a kind of, it's really weird actually when you read old children's books like sort of Tintin and Asterix, where people are just that kind of rampant alcoholism and how hilariously funny it is, and then sort of reading Le Guin and the Hasia, where it's a very, very kind of sad, nuanced. They're very clearly it did really actually sort of frighten me and put me off drugs. I remember it's something that's been very vivid in my mind for my whole life. But that also it's very kind of sympathetic and empathetic towards particularly the character of Hans, the character who is the main character is presented using it, and the fact his life is ruin and his life has been destroyed by it, but also so direct sense of pity for him. So yeah, I think that's a really, really good, powerful scene about drugs. It's very realistically portrayed and fits beautifully within the book. And the fact, of course, that Ged himself uses the drug, who is a kind of hero, you know, he uses it is interesting. And the fact that he's not kind of saying, oh, this is bad that they're doing, it's very sad that he sees so many of them taking it. But again, he takes it, he thinks it will help them on their quest. So that was really interesting for me.
That is a fascinating example. Thanks for that, because I mean, sadness is a very powerful word. You know, we see drugs used as power enhancers, or we see them as kind of demon. You know, a character's demon, which is also a powerful thing. But sadness is probably something that runs through all those. You know, and regret and probably self-loathing to some degree coming into it. But it's probably not often dealt with in a sympathetic way, as you describe. And I suppose we can trust Ursula to give us that perspective. You know, maybe the not the obvious perspective, but nonetheless a very powerful one. That's a great example. Any others?
I to switch up from books, I really enjoyed the depiction of Shimmer in Arcane, the TV series. I thought they did quite a good job of both showing the sympathy side of it, but also the downsides. And you know, obviously the idea of Shimmer was that it was originally developed as a healing drug, and then it gives supernatural abilities, but also rage, and you know, makes them these impressive, almost, you know, berserker fighters in a way. And then, but obviously it tears you apart. And I thought, you know, a lot of people do turn to drugs as a form of self-medicating and things like that. And so the idea that this started out as a healing drug, but ultimately ends up causing more harm and things like that, I thought that was quite a good way of depicting it. And there's a scene where one of the people who's at the lowest of low, you know, really warped face from using this drug for a long time, is still shown both sympathetically but also doing whatever he has to do to survive and get more. You know, it's both sympathetic and really heartbreaking for everyone involved, because it shows, you know, the lengths that some people will go to with addiction to get what they need, but also in a way that you don't hate that character. You just feel bad, you know, even though they've done a bad thing, they've sold out one of the main characters, you know, to get more of the drug, even though the scene before they were being sympathetic and kind. You know, and you know, that fits with, you know, the experience of addiction, is that it drives you to do things that you would never normally do. And I like the way that character is, even though they've done a bad thing, to do what they needed to do. You don't hate them, you just feel sad for their situations, you know. So I thought that was quite well done.
Yeah, and it's a very the transformative effect, very heightened in Arcane, of course, very dramatic visually. But yeah, and it almost kind of connects to that Jekyll and Hyde analogy of or reference of Stew's. Yeah, that is a good one. If there aren't any more examples, and
I mean, I was going to chat a little bit about.
Good. Please do. Yes.
When I was putting my notes together for this, the object, the media I ended up looking at the most, funnily enough, was video games, which are, you know, quite capitalist objects. They're a lot, mechanics wise, it's a lot of numbers go up. And the interesting relationship between that and drugs, and them acting as drug simulators. You make money, you exchange it for drugs. The drugs affect your character. The come down is barely recognized. Maybe the screen will go a bit blurry. But there's so many interesting examples doing interesting things. I mean, we should talk about potions at some point, right? as an example of fantasy. I was thinking about The Witcher for that, things like that. And then laudanum actually comes up in Amnesia. We were just talking, I think you brought that up, didn't you, Robin? Laudanum is an addictive substance. It is used in Amnesia as a healing item to ward off the sort of madness that the protagonist is experiencing. But also, yeah, it's difficult to find examples of dependency being depicted in video games. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, skooma is the famous example from one of the Elder Scrolls games where there are mechanics for come down and dependency on it, and your stats gradually reduce the more you use and get addicted to the skooma. I haven't yet looked up how true that is. That feels like a story I've heard, but if it is true, that's cool. That's really interesting, and that is almost
I think it was in Morrowind. It was in Morrowind.
Thank you. And then pen and paper RPGs as well. For the plenty of drugs, plenty of substances you can take. The one that caught my eye for that, and memory again, was Dark Heresy, an old Warhammer 40,000 one, where all of the drugs in that came with rules for come downs, for effects after the fact that, you know, your character, you as a role player, are expected to role play not only the high but the low, which is unusual. Again, this isn't something that often comes up, because, as you know, pen and paper RPGs tend to, in the mainstream Dungeons and Dragons, be power fantasies. So you get the highs, you don't get so much, get the lows. Yeah, anyway, video games, really interesting as drug simulators, and giving people an opportunity to play through drugs, through addictive substances without the risk. Really interesting.
That's a perspective I had not considered, I must admit. Cool, yeah. Interesting to see how some players might play through that in a tabletop RPG. Yeah, cool.
There are some actual plays. The one that came up for me that I remembered was season 2 of Critical Role, a character called Not the Brave who was an alcoholic. So there are examples for you to watch on the internet.
Interesting. No, I shall jot that down.
I think if we're going to talk a little bit about games, I would lift up Disco Elysium, which I think is probably my favourite game of the last 2 or 3 years. It's you play a dishevelled alcoholic policeman who wakes up from a bender so extreme he can't remember why he's even in the town he's in, and he's undressed. One of his first things he is to go and find his clothes. It's a deeply poignant. I mean, it's funny. It is very blackly funny. It's also hugely poignant about why he is in the position he's in, and it's absolutely fantastic game. And it deals with that whole addiction thing, I think, really well, and it's central to the story. I think a lot of the stuff I've looked at, addiction and drugs in particular, are just part of the scenery. They're not central to the story. But in Disco Elysium, it's absolutely crucial to the story.
No, this is great stuff. It's very interesting to go in different directions. Thanks very much for bringing these examples. Hopefully some things there for folks to go and have a look at. So let me bring it to a more personal perspective, if you like. And yes, there are 1 or 2 folks here who will have more to say about this maybe than others, but please do give us an example or some perspective and some thoughts of how you've handled this sort of subject in your own works. And I'll maybe bring this back to Anna, if I may, because you mentioned it in your introduction, and I must admit I absolutely adore those books, and that is certainly a very prominent aspect. So I will invite you to speak about that, if you will.
Yeah, so yes, huge spoiler alert that my trilogy Empires of Dust, the major protagonist Marith has significant drug and alcohol issues throughout the whole trilogy. And someone said to me, he's basically Jim Morrison, isn't he? Sort of, yeah, he's kind of, he is that kind of taking that sort of bad boy rock star kind of, anti-hero, which is so common in a lot of the sort of darker grimdark books, fantasy books I read. The kind of the character who will sort of sit up all night drinking a whole bottle of brandy with his friends, and then the next morning he will somehow be kind of incredibly hungover but still getting up, doing stuff, and kind of that kind of hard drinking, but somehow still functioning. And the characters often will kind of make this sort of like, I was aware I was drinking too much, but there is that kind of romanticizing of it in a lot of kind of quite gritty hard fantasy. It is that kind of linking of a particular kind of masculinity and of kind of risk taking and of doing something a bit edgy with with substance abuse and use of drugs and alcohol. I remember talking to someone about, it was an interview that one of I think the Guardian ran with Bobby Gillespie, the lead singer of Primal Scream, saying, I met Bobby at lunchtime the day after his concert. He was wearing the shirt he'd been wearing the night before, which was covered in vomit. And yeah, on the face of it, obviously you're kind of like, my God, that's disgusting. But, it's projecting as a kind of, wow, how hardcore is this guy? He's so rock and roll. And a lot of what I was doing with the character of Mareth in Empires of Dust was taking that trope. And as someone who has known people who have been destroyed through drug and alcohol use, who's seen the consequences of it in my own family, and who I knew people who were have been destroyed by it. I wanted to kind of write. I didn't want to. I say I want to write as if it was very conscious. It wasn't, but I was writing both that kind of glamorous rock star fantasy, which is a huge trope of a lot of cultural artifacts still in the West. That kind of notion of the bad boy rock star with his bottle of spirits is a very romantic trope still, and that's somehow appealing. And writing that, but also Mareth's beautiful. He is beautiful, and lots of people talk about how beautiful he is. There's a sort of joke at one point about how he's sort of brought back to the lodgings they're staying in unconscious, covered in puke, and the woman who runs the lodging house is still like, oh my God, he's so beautiful, oh, he's so sexy, oh, I love him. Because that is a huge, that is a sort of part of him. And it's something that, I can't pretend I don't I've read a lot of books about that kind of anti-hero character. I can't pretend it's not a romantic trope that a lot of people, including myself, find quite attractive. But I also was writing about the destructiveness of it, the kind of the horrible reality of it. There's a reference to, he's referenced him pissing and shooting himself, that kind of, and the effect it has on those around him. So it was kind of writing that tightrope, walking that tightrope. It wasn't conscious, actually. I had no idea he had these issues until the first scene where he appears and has these issues. And I was like, that makes a lot of sense about him. And actually part of it was also simply, I kind of wanted to write my own scene with Hazier Root, because that scene in Further Shore has been a thing that's a real thing that has affected me, and it has been one of the kind of, I wanted to write a little bit referencing that, and it possibly got out of control. But yeah, it's very much a kind of conscious writing about that kind of hard man trope and the kind of use of drugs and alcohol in fantasy to show the kind of anti-hero figure, the kind of bad boy figure, and try and unpack it a bit from a kind of feminist perspective, but also from a kind of unpack it culturally from a kind of, this is attractive, but it's also destructive, and talking about it and trying to get inside his mind and how he feels, and the fact that he is both repelled by his own inability, his own addictions, and trying to kind of, but also it's fun. He's a young man enjoying himself, and that kind of, I want to sort of, I'm rambling really, but yeah, that was a lot. It is quite a complicated, it's complicated for me to write about, because I have to admit I have complicated feelings about it. That kind of romantic trope of the bad boy anti-hero is something, it's so baked into a lot of culture, and particularly a lot of kind of alternative music.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so baked into that kind of, and he has, his love interest is very kind of she doesn't have substance abuse issues, and some people have sort of suggested, there are issues in their relationship because, she's somehow facilitating or kept into this sort of relationship with someone who has substance abuse issues. And then other people have sort of said, well, she's busy running the empire while he's whacked out in the bedroom. And that all the kind of, it was writing about kind of my complex feelings about that kind of figure.
I think that comes across brilliantly because all the characters are very complex, and and him probably more than any, but I think that conflictedness comes through very well.
I've had issues. I've not made a secret, I don't think, about the fact I've had issues with food and things in my life, most of my adult life, and that relationship with food and binging and craving and just trying to stop and things is something that kind of, I was right at that, the kind of mental health and the kind of binging and desire and wanting to stop was something that was very, very personal. It was me writing out sort of stuff, slightly different, so writing out some very personal stuff and sort of trying to kind of get into it and unpack it a bit and kind of deal with it. And again, there's that kind of romanticism of that kind of, to go kind of off topic, but the kind of the female equivalent of the kind of rock star who's covered in issues, wearing a shirt that's still covered in puke is in some ways that kind of, the woman who talks about the kind of crazy pixie dream girl who has food issues, who has mental health issues, who has self-harm issues, and that the two kind of are two sides of the same archetype coin.
Yes, but I certainly can't think of and maybe there are some that I'm just not aware of, and that's probably telling in itself, examples of that other side of the coin, as you put it, in genre literature, because I would think it's a much more difficult subject to write about than, as you say, that kind of almost lionized character who drinks hard and gets up the next day to fight or whatever. It is a well recognized trope, and is sort of celebrated and to a certain degree.
Yeah, there's actually that real slight awkwardness even in watching Lord of the Rings films with my son, with this the drinking scene when they were in which film? It must be in. Is it the beginning of the Return of the King when they're celebrating? No, it's the end of the Two Towers, isn't it? Where they're having the big drinking. They have Gimli and Legolas have a big drinking competition to celebrate their victory. And again, you're sort of like, oh yeah, it's so comic watching someone drink until he passes out, isn't it?
So we're still doing this. Yeah, and probably we will be for a while yet.
Yes.
Ollie, can I invite you at this point to talk about Glitterati, which is a book that I adore, but it certainly has something to say on this subject.
Yeah, sure. I think Dark Star is probably more addicty, but Glitterati is full of people who imbibe a lot of white powder. It's not named, but it's clearly cocaine. There are mountains of it. They have little custom straws that they screw up their noses to take in huffs of this powder. And in fact, the powder ends up being something of a catalyst for the book. It's a deeply silly book. It's about people with too much money and too much power, and it satirizes them using that powder. But on the other hand, Dark Star, my first book, is a fairly straightforward science fiction metaphor for heroin. The local drug of choice is called Prometheus, liquid light. So imagine heroin, but with an aesthetic element. It makes your veins glow. And in a world where in a city on a planet where the local sun doesn't emit light on a visible spectrum, there are a lot of light addicts in it, including my noir hero. There's another trope for you. Anna's bringing up the rock star kind of figure. I'm bringing up the noir detective, no good, broken kind of guy. And in this, he's sort of relying on the drug to keep him together. I can give you 3 very, very quick stanzas just from the start. Time to waste. So I escaped the city at one of those seedy establishments they call glow shows, because they fill the girls so full of pro it nearly burns their veins. Prometheus, resident wonder drug. Promo, Theus, liquid fucking light, prohibited by city law and shot by yours truly, Virgil York, hero cop. These moments, liquid light coursing through me, trickling across my veins in streams, feeling like fluttering fingers under my skin, are all that's left holding me together. And that's from the opening of the book. So yeah, he spends pretty much the whole book wrestling with addiction and interacting with the folk who have no light at all in the city. They're called ghosts, the absolute lightless, occasionally lit up by the headlights of people who can afford lights for their cars, getting run down, chasing after stray glows. Lots, very interesting to write an addict like that. That's me.
Okay, thank you very much. Stu or Jenny, do you want to? If not necessary, please go ahead. Stu frozen up.
No,
No, sorry, I thought your screen had frozen.
Just very still. Jenny, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I have worked a lot in my professional medical career with a lot of addictions. So I've actually steered quite clear of this in my writing for a specific reason, and it's because I see writing as a bit of an escape as well, and so I feel that to write it properly, I'd have to write a story about addiction to do it justice. And I think that personally isn't something that I'm at the point of writing at the moment. And that's not to say that it's not an important story to tell. And I really enjoyed lots of depictions of it, reading about it and things like that. I think the thing to remember about addictions and writing it is that everyone's going to approach it with a different angle and a different lens and a different experience. And it's good to get a lot of these different ways of seeing it across. And I do enjoy reading all these different perspectives. My personal perspective is quite a bleak one sometimes, which is why sometimes I haven't written about it. For at my work, for example, I've worked in GP practices, I've worked in all sorts of different hospital wards, I've worked in A&E departments, Glasgow Royal Infirmary, working with a lot of East End of Glasgow patients and things like that. And addiction is part of the fabric of society at the moment, to our detriment. And so for example, I've been vomited on, I've been physically threatened for drugs, I've been when I refused to prescribe them, for example, I've had patients yell at me and things like that, and I've saved a person's life by giving them naloxone after they've OD'd on heroin, only for them to take a swing at me because I ruined their high. So, and this isn't an unusual experience for a doctor or a nurse or a healthcare professional. It's a reasonably standard thing, but I think the most important thing is that these behaviours, they used to be seen as it was a moral failing. And these days we know that that's not the case. It's a specific medical condition that needs sympathy and respect. Okay. So do you want me to go into the science side for just 1 minute? Would you like it?
Let me first say, and please do give us that perspective, but that's very powerful what you're saying, and I completely understand why you would not want to bring that in to your writing. I've got a question later on which might bring us back to that, but I'm sure if you did at some point decide that you could or wanted to write something with that strand or that theme in it, that it would be incredibly powerful and obviously from that perspective very accurate. But yeah, please, do you want to, you were going to touch upon the scientific? Please do.
Sometimes if you understand the science of addiction, you kind of have actually more sympathy than you would otherwise, and I think that's sometimes helpful to have. And actually a lot of addiction is to do with dopamine, so it doesn't matter what the thing is that you're addicted to, it's all about dopamine in the brain. So dopamine is the primary driver of your survival instincts, your motivation, and everyone has a normal range of dopamine. It's between about 40 and 100. Okay, 40 is your basics. You're like, you do something basic, you get that dopamine hit as a reward. Okay, so you get up in the morning, you have a cup of coffee, for example. It's enough to get you out of bed. 100 is maybe the best thing in the world. Okay, so you're having the best day of your life, you're having a great time. About 94 is your favorite foods. About 92 is sex, things like that. So these are your kind of basic levels of dopamine. So you add in a drug to that mix, and it makes a big difference. So these are your survival drivers. You get a reward every time you do something that helps you survive. Okay, so procreation, eating, drinking. Something like methamphetamine will drive that level to about 1,000. That's crazy, right? About 1,000. Alcohol, at least a few hundred, things like that. Okay, so you're vastly resetting your system of reward pathways. So your whole limbic system starts to get rewired the more often you do this, because you start to get used to this higher level. And the more often you do it, the more your brain tries to modulate it, okay? Because when you have that much dopamine, it's like a euphoric feeling. And you get used to that. And then your body starts to reduce its dopamine receptors, and you get tolerant to whatever you're doing. So you just do more and more. And then when you don't do it, instead of going to that baseline level of maybe 40, you go to 10 or 20. So suddenly everything else goes out the window. You have to do it. And it's not because you want to do it. It's not because you crave the high. It's because your brain is telling you, if you don't do it, you'll die. This is a desperation thing. This is very much a survival drive. Imagine someone, you were walking through a desert, days and days. You were day 3, you're about to die of thirst. You see someone with a bottle of water in front of you. You're desperate, your throat is dry, that you've sweated so much that there's nothing more to sweat. You're barely stood. All you can think about is getting that glass of water. And someone says, you can't have it. What would you do? And then think about drug addiction and magnify it by about 100 times. So the behaviors that I described earlier, the things that they've done, things like that, that's a symptom of addiction. That's not a moral failing. That's not, this is something to have sympathy for and respect, because the bad behavior is their brain telling them, if you do not do this, you will die. So that's the kind of science behind it, and why before I understood that, I was less sympathetic. And now that I understand more about addictions and things like that, I think I have a lot more sympathy. And it also explains a lot about certain depictions and why certain depictions seem more accurate and some seem less authentic, for example. And I think so sometimes having that background grounding can give you more of an idea about character motivations and things as well like that.
And that's something I certainly didn't appreciate myself, and thanks for that explanation. It was very clear that at a certain point, I don't know how far it is in necessarily, you're actually just trying to get back to a normal baseline. You're in a hole, and it's not even about getting the high. It's about trying to maintain, or there's an element of actually needing to get back to the baseline before you go anywhere else, as it were. Very, very interesting explanation. Thank you, Jenny. Stu, do you wish to add anything?
Yeah, it's probably a good place to come in, actually. I think so. In Tangle's game, the eponymous Tangle is he's bipolar, and actually one of his coping mechanisms is he's developed an addiction to drugs that kind of help him regulate that for various reasons. It's not explored hugely in the book in terms of out on the page, but his behavior and certainly some of his interactions with other characters who know where he's at kind of spell out the fact that he is an addict who is clean at the current time, or at least at the start of the book, or when he first appears in the book. But other people know are able to manipulate him because he is someone who is vulnerable. And I think one of the things I wanted to explore with him is, despite the fact that he is quite a selfish person and a person who he's not the hero of the book, that's the real protagonist is somebody else in the book. He is nevertheless somebody who is vulnerable and kind of really a really important person in a number of people's lives, both for good and quite bad reasons. That there, you can be important for the wrong reasons, right? And he's definitely important for the wrong reasons. And so I think what I wanted to explore with him is how sometimes you can be the wrong person for somebody because of who you are, and he is the wrong person for a lot of those people in this book. But they're not passive about this. Like, few of us are ever passive when someone has done us wrong, and their response to him is to exacerbate his addiction and to take advantage of it and to exploit him as much as he is kind of behaving badly towards them. And for me, that was quite important, because I think too often drug addiction and drug addicts are a cipher, or they're a bit one-dimensional. They're there to move the plot along. And I really wanted to avoid that with him. And I think kind of setting that kind of on one side, because for me, or before we set that on one side, for me, any sort of kind of human experience like that has to be kind of grounded in some sort of dignity. Otherwise, it doesn't feel authentic, at least to me, because I think in the end, we're all capable of being in that situation. And I think if we're going to write about it, we owe it to everybody concerned to kind of try and make it as authentic as possible. And in that case, you have to make those people, you have to give them the dignity of being human, rather than kind of one-dimensional or ciphers for something else that you're trying to say. Sure, say those other things too, but you're going to be much more successful if people can look at your people on the page and go, okay, I understand, I see that, that was a real person to me. Kind of setting kind of to one side of that, my first novel, A Family War, is set kind of 3-4 centuries into the future, and rich people have medicine that is totally personalized and means that they can abuse drugs all day long, and then the medicine that they have access to will remove the negative consequences, so they can do their highs but their brains won't reset, or if they get so far that their brains reset, they can go and have some medicine and it will kind of bring them back to their proper baseline. And clearly, in that sort of society, there will be people who don't want the reset, right? They're taking drugs for reasons that they don't want that reset, right? They are trying to escape from other things. They are doing people do drugs for all sorts of reasons, right? From pleasure all the way through to kind of desperation and self-hatred or whatever it might be. So in this story, the rich in particular, the oligarchs, are absolutely capable of being taking their drugs that aren't available to others, that are totally illegal in wider circulation, and being completely free from any consequences. And so for them, it's legal because they don't have any negative consequences on the people around them, because they're just enjoying a high, and then the medicine sorts them out. And then I have a particular character who decides to not avail themselves of that medicine, and we kind of explore with them just how horrible the consequences of that can be. Which it would be for everybody else, but they're rich enough to have avoided consequences for their whole lives.
Very interesting.
Sorry, I was coming actually about that point Stu was making about people around people enabling people, because again, that enabling someone and kind of and enabling their substance issues and enabling their kind of almost their kind of collapse, because again, that's something that I was sort of writing about more and more as I was moving into the kind of the third book of my trilogy, House of Sacrifice, where Marith is, I mean, by that point he's got this huge court around him. There's a lot of kind of power, and there's a sense of a lot of people manipulating him and enabling him and being able to use. Definitely not fine. It's in no one's interest to stop him and try and rein him in, because obviously they can exploit him around that. And actually that put me in mind actually of bizarrely, watching last week of all things, the recent film of David Copperfield and Ardo Iannucci's did, and the presentation of that of Uriah Heep and what he does to I cannot remember his name, it's gone completely off my head, but the David Copperfield's employer, and the way he uses alcohol to completely exploit him and destroy him, and it's so subtly done. It's not a big thing, but it's incredibly painful watching that way in which someone is cut in a couple of scenes. You can see someone's entire life being destroyed through someone else in just this incredibly kind of subtle, elegant way, and what is an incredibly funny, light-hearted film, but with this kind of real sense, again, that real sense of pain and of loss and of sympathy for someone being destroyed by someone else, and that great sense of sympathy you have. I think that's actually that was something I was trying to kind of play with and to write about a little as well, that sense of someone who's being enabled and destroyed by someone, and that kind of it becomes harder and harder to say no, and you are becoming kind of losing yourself and others around you, facilitating and encouraging that. And that kind of, I mean, you read in a sort of a lot of, you read about actually kind of slightly alarming number of rulers throughout history who had alcohol problems, and there's that sense of kind of people in the court facilitating that and encouraging that, and kind of, because it's in a lot of other people's interests to keep the person who's supposedly in charge in this kind of stupefied state. And it's it's that horrible kind of tragic enabling of someone, or of the kind of the rock star with huge amounts of money, where it's in a lot of people's interest to enable that and encourage them not to be questioning things and to be losing their sense of their own autonomy. So it's kind of again when you're writing about power, which so much of writing fantasy is about power structures of power and relationships of power. It's kind of that the way that drugs and substance abuse and kind of are used to exploit and control and use power. In fact, not in the kind of opium sort of used to control the populace by the leadership, but by people around, people of power, to try and exploit them and shape them, is something interesting that fantasy could perhaps engage with a little more in a slightly perhaps more subtle way, or at least I was trying to kind of engage with a bit.
And that's an excellent point, because there are, and that's a superb adaptation. That's the one with Dev Patel.
Yes, yes,
and Hugh Laurie's I think it's the.
It's not the Hugh Laurie character. No, it's Dora's father. I cannot remember his name. But he's.
I'm afraid that's escaped me as well.
Yes.
But Dickens is, I mean, we're talking kind of genre examples, obviously, but Dickens is a very rich source of complex characters who are controlled by many emotions and personal foibles, of course. So no, that was very a very varied response to that question. That was excellent. So how about we think of maybe things in a slightly different way, or maybe sort of conflate to the questions that I had in mind, because Stu, I think it was you who mentioned the importance of treating the topic as not as a one-dimensional one, and Anna, you've just said how the perhaps it's not sufficiently explored sometimes how a powerful individual is manipulated by those around him with using addiction as a vehicle, and I'd thought to maybe explore some of the less good examples, perhaps, and that I think would probably agree would be the kind of one-dimensional ones, or maybe instances where drugs are used as more as props or MacGuffins, which aren't particularly relevant to story as such, and I mean that doesn't make them wrong, if you like, and they're not necessarily there to be in a given story be the center of the plot. For example, there's reference in Star Wars, of course, to the spice mines of Kessel and things like that, and it's, you know, it's just as a line to illustrate a particular point. Red pill and blue pill in the Matrix arguably is not, you know, they're more just like a token, if you like, to send the story in a particular way. But there are examples in this genre or genres that you don't like for any particular reason that we might talk about?
So I'm struggling to find the novels in which I see this, but I think one of the places where I struggle on this is where people use drug addiction as a motive explanation for bad behavior. It's almost, you know, it's not as bad as fridging, but it's in the same category for me. I find it lazy, and I find it. I just think there's much better ways of helping people, helping your characters kind of have reasons for doing the things they do. Sure, if they are an addict, they are, you know, real addicts do bad things because they're addicts, sure, but there's fully rounded people inside those kind of human beings, and so I find it quite annoying when that's the excuse for whatever behavior someone's doing.
No, it's an excellent point, and Jenni's given us some great information, if you like, some background to explain that, if you like, or support why that's the wrong thing to do, or not a useful thing to do. Yes.
I think if I weighed in here, what I would say is that I don't necessarily think that having drugs as set dressing is necessarily bad. So I think that, yes, you can tell a story with addiction at the fore, or you can tell it as a side plot, but referencing drugs in different worlds, you don't necessarily have to write a huge amount of detail if you're aiming for sort of that realism vibe, because in reality there are drugs in the fabric of all of our societies. It's not a good thing, but it's there, and if you deny it, it's kind of denying reality. So if you're trying to strive for that sort of magical realism, or you know, grounded sci-fi, often it can feel a bit more gritty and grounded if you include references to drug use as well and things like that. And if that works in the context of that story, I'm fine with it. Do you know what I mean? I think the ones that I really don't like is where, as you're saying, where it's a really unsympathetic one-dimensional view, or if it's justifying bad behavior, but that's all they do. That's all they're there to do, is do bad things because they're addicted to something, and they're portrayed in this one-dimensional way where all it is the drug. There's nothing else. And you know what? All these people who experience drug use at various levels of drug use, there's always something else. You know, there's always something else to them that they bring to the world. Like, no one is ever a write-off, and you know, no one is ever just a demon full of drugs. They will always have like something that you can talk about with them that's not drug related. It might be all that's on the mind at that particular moment, but there is more there. And to miss that and just write someone as a husk who's addicted to drugs and has nothing else about them, I hate that. So yeah, that's it.
Because it is perfectly possible to function with some drugs, to function, as long as you keep, it's the withdrawal that can be the issue. I mean, sort of, yeah, I know I'm not talking about cigarettes, but I mean, you know, you can, it's not someone who is a massively addicted to cigarettes obviously can manage fine. If you think about society tomorrow was suddenly to announce that nicotine was illegal, you'd have a lot of people in your office who would be spending the next couple of weeks an absolute wreck, completely unable to function. And that kind of, you know, lots of people who suddenly become truly appalling parents, lots of people who have become, you know, absolutely appalling to have around the house as your partner because they were going through massive nicotine withdrawal. But it's not, you know, it's that kind of idea that someone is just totally fucked up by taking drugs, that, you know, they cannot function as part of society, they must be outcasts, is actually completely untrue. Again, it's saying, you know, drugs, a lot of drugs that are illegal now used to be legal and people were taking them, that and functioning. So that kind of notion that someone is sort of just completely off their head is, again, like unrealistic, and kind of, again, it's sort of that, and that sort of moral, so again, and also that kind of moral sense that they must be, someone wants to experience altered consciousness, they must be, there's something not right about them. I mean, actually, historically, people, most societies, people were using substances, not addicted to something, but using substances to experience different states of consciousness. And then kind of idea that staying completely sober all the time is morally better would not have been really, that kind of notion that you don't experience altered states of consciousness would have been considered to be very strange. Which is a horrible mix of, horrible mashup of 2 points there, but
no, not at all. The aspect of sympathy or understanding for the addict is certainly one that there are probably far fewer examples of than that lionized heroic rock star quality and that you're describing. And that was certainly one of the things that I found so very powerful about the Empires of Dust, and I think I posted about it around the time of having read it, the series, to say that I was absolutely hooked by it, but wasn't sure I actually liked any of the characters. And I know it's not about, I think that's, in my head, that's kind of powerful recommendation in the sense that a lot of people say they don't like a story because they didn't like any of the characters or something like that. But as stories and books are just, and characters are just totally compelling, and it's like an inability to take eyes off the page kind of thing, as these characters self-destruct and then somehow rebuild themselves and keep going, and yeah, maybe we need more stories about redemption. I don't know in this sort of sphere, but no, I mean, very, very interesting.
Difficult also because redemption is always, and then I got clean and I never took drugs again. And hey, I'm a reserve. I found God, got clean, and found a good woman, and I'm kind of got to have 2 kids and a dog, and that's redemption. That kind of, which, I mean, obviously, that's a wonderful outcome, but that that kind of incredibly moral kind of sort of redemption is putting all that behind you. That's gone. That was another life. That was that was bad, and we closed the door, and now we're moving on to be good and clean. I mean, again, it's really difficult because you couldn't possibly say that isn't an infinitely better. And Jenni will say that people she's dealt with who had drug issues, if they were to get clean, find a nice woman, have 2 kids and a dog, that would be, the most wonderful thing you'd imagine. But at the same time, it's such a kind of morally loaded. Redemption is becoming part of, redemption's kind of becoming a Tory voting taxpayer kind of homeowner. And that.
Yeah, I must say, when I said that word, I did not have that in my head. That kind of transformation, if you like, into someone who I hesitate to say doesn't have any problems, but doesn't still carry around with them that particular problem. But I suppose I meant in a kind of a story sense, thinking about Stu's point about the one-dimensional character who's seen as being a bad influence on the story, if you like, or the plot, and is there to do negative things, but almost a kind of redemption of that kind of character and the way that character is treated in genre stories, in a much more we could hope perhaps that to see them seen in a more sensitive light, as Ursula Le Guin has shown us is possible, if you like.
I think it's an interesting one in terms of set dressing. I think it can tell you a whole lot about the world via the shorthand of what type of drugs are being done, right? So when Ollie talks about drugs that make your veins glow, it tells you a whole lot about the world, right? It's a really smart piece of world building because you say, there's no visible light. Oh, and the drugs make your veins glow. There's a huge amount there, right? And it's super short, and you don't have to say very much. But we all immediately have kind of touch points from media we've consumed and the world as we kind of experience it. Kind of here in the UK and in the US, that slots right into, and so in terms of set dressing, it can be a really powerful world building thing. I mean, Ollie, you probably want to talk about your own work more than me referencing you, but I think things like that are really good, right? Because they tell you a little bit about that the world is familiar in a way that you can recognize, whilst also othering it in a way, right? So it says to you, this is a world that's different, but hey, it's not that different, right? There's these parallels that you're going to kind of find there that you're going to make it understandable.
It's a process of defamiliarization. So you take something very familiar and twist it just a little bit to make it interesting in a science fictional speculative sort of way. Yeah, I think if I had anything to add to this, it would be following on from talking about games and the way that they tend to, broadly speaking, trivialize substances in that there isn't really a downside to simulating using them. That in a sense, it's I don't know what the responsible sort of approach would be to game design that takes a more responsible examination of substance use or substance abuse. But broadly speaking, even the downsides are fun in games, right? Which is odd, and it feels like a strange sort of way of exploring what is an issue.
I think mechanistically in games it's quite tricky, right? Because like if take the most basic of them all, D&D. You'll have a period of time where you get a minor bonus, but then the downsides are so negative that you look at it and you go, I'm never taking drugs. it's like I'm never doing that. Why would I do that? It's stupid. And that's kind of I'm not sure there's a moralistic element to it, right? But I mean, there may well be in the minds, subconsciously in the minds of the writers. But you kind of look at it on paper with the numbers and you go, there's no way I'm ever doing that. There's no mechanism that makes my character go, yes, I want 10 minutes of euphoric high, followed by several hours of impaired agency.
Well, having the statistics to know exactly how it's going to affect you, of course, it allows you to make a very balanced decision.
But yeah, I mean, that brings us to potions, which are a really, really interesting sort of substance to think about in terms of, you never hear of potion addiction, or is there? Is there media with potion addiction?
Adrian. The book and the book title and the author has gone completely from my head. Adrian, not Adrian Tchaikovsky. Adrian has a guy called Adrian.
Oh,
Snakewood. Adrian Selby, Snakewood.
Thank you very much.
Yes, that has. I'm so sorry, Adrian. I'm so sorry for completely forgetting your name and your book title. But yeah, I've had a bad week at work. It's Adrian, and it's the end of term, so my brain is gone. My children have been off school for half a day now, and my brain is gone. But yeah, Adrian Selby Snakewood, they use brews and potions as their group of mercenaries who use brews and potions to give themselves basically improved abilities and things. And it is kind of addictive, and they are talking about them as drugs, but they're brewing things. There's a lot of stuff about them brewing stuff up to sort of work as a mercenary troop. So it is that kind of using substances to improve your abilities, but it is addictive, and there are issues that they have issues about it. But yeah, so it's almost a kind of much more kind of gritty sort of thuggy, similar to sort of things like mentats in Dune, that kind of, you're using a substance, which again is something that from the Lynch film is something that actually obsessed me, the mentats and the stained lips and the way you're using the substance to vastly improve your mental processing, but you're also losing something and complete that kind of like, who would possibly want to do that, but also, my God, I could completely want to do that kind of. So yeah, that's like, which is sort of, that kind of potions and changing self. So yeah, Adrian Selby does it anyway in Snakewood.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, another question I had, which I've been thinking about, is vampirism. Could that be read as addiction? And if so, what use is it as a reading of addiction?
I wondered whether to either specifically include or exclude vampirism at the beginning, and I thought I'll just leave it alone and see what happens. So I think I'm
throw that grenade in. Yeah,
I think I'm indebted to you for raising that. I don't know. We'll find out. Does anyone have anything to?
More just like eating. I mean, if you had someone who didn't eat, they would eventually die. Similarly, the vampires just need to drink blood occasionally.
So the recent film Renfield does something fun with this, where it is absolutely an addiction for Dracula, right? And he can't function without it, but B, he doesn't just want some, he wants all of it, and he wants it all the time, and he wants it now. It's absolutely there, a compulsion all the time. But I think in most depictions of vampirism, it's less of a drug addiction thing. I think. I mean, it's about I think tradition. I don't know. There's a whole lot of words written about kind of purity cults and corruption of the blood and things like that. But yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I think Renfield does a fun thing about making vampirism about drug addiction for sure.
I mean, it's Pratchett as well, isn't it? With the vampire, the Black Ribboners.
Yes.
Who avowed blood and have a little sing song, and is clearly a metaphor for like AA meetings and etc.
Well, I'm going to link or try. Hopefully, it's not too tenuous a link to link two things together, because Stu's talking about Jekyll and Hyde earlier on, and since you've raised vampirism, Ollie, I'm going to throw in a reference to Kim Newman's Anno Dracula books, which, if you haven't read them, people out there, they are phenomenal. I'm not a great fan of horror specifically, to be honest, but I can't read them fast enough. They're very, very interesting, and vampirism is a massive aspect in them. And I suppose alternate history is probably the easiest description, but there are a lot more than that. And so many names that folks will recognize are in there, and the portrayal of vampirism is very interesting. It feels very thoughtful, and can't really use the word realistic, but you know what I mean. It considers the impact on the vampire, on the do I use the word victim? Maybe in some cases, but not necessarily in other cases. It's not leading me to necessarily answering the question of whether vampirism should be considered as an addiction or not, but that there are certainly addictive aspects to it, in the sense that they do it to survive. So that is a good point. I think probably on balance we would have been remiss not to touch upon it. So thank you, Ollie, for that one.
I mean, my other sort of thought leading on from that is, blood addiction to blood is interesting. That is interesting. That is something fantasy can do. Science fiction fantasy do. We can push these ideas. We can get. What are the weirdest sort of stories about addiction narratives that you've encountered? Because I was thinking about Charlie Mieville's Embassy Town, which is a story about addiction.
It's going to be my answer.
Right, yeah. Which is about addiction to sound, to lie, people speaking simultaneously and lying. Yeah, it's absolutely wild, absolutely fascinating. And I was wondering what other examples there were, because that was like the best one that I could come up with, and Stu is immediately jumping to. But
Oh.
what other, like, because this is what our genre does, right? We can push things to weird places.
It's an extraordinary story about, is it an Alan Moore story about a drug that there's a guy going to a kind of dodgy club and there's a drug and everyone's talking about this drug and he's desperately trying to find out what the drug is. And what it eventually turns out to be is the Lovecraftian language of the old ones. And someone whispers it to you and it kind of gets into your brain and you are there, that's the drug, and that's the change, is that kind of, that is the Lovecraftian moment of the kind of the cosmic void opening in front of you.
That sounds
But it's
very,
done
very
purely
Alan
through the
Moore.
language, or the language itself is somehow addictive, and the drug. I think it's Alan Moore. It's in a book called The Starry Wisdom, which is kind of really interesting eco-feminist Christiavian takes on Lovecraft. And I'm sure that that's in there. And I think it's Alan Moore. Someone, if anyone knows the story I'm talking about.
Ollie mentioned quite rightly the weird and wonderful places that SFF can take us, and since China may have also had a mention, I have to mention Jeff Noon, because I could spend the next 20 minutes trying to describe Jeff Noon to people and fail hopelessly. So I just recommend going to the John Nyquist books and probably starting there. But there are an addiction. Again, is it addiction? Is it compulsion? What would you call it? But the worlds that he, or societies that he imagines in those books, like there's one where essentially the society and its people are addicted to storytelling in essence, and have to be always kind of constructing a narrative around everything that they do. And the Vert, which has the feathers in it, is an example of which are, I'm not suggesting in any way a reference in one direction or another, but they in a kind of a red pill, blue pill kind of way open up, gateways to different places. And I could go on citing examples, but I'd recommend to anyone with an interest in this kind of topic to check out the John Nyquist books of Jeff Noon.
I mean, we should probably mention, as much as I'm loath to do so, Infinite Jest, the good old David Foster Wallace. Oh no, he's been brought up, sorry. He is, which is, I mean, it is a satire of, media consumption, but where people become addicted to watching a video over and over again, which is interesting for, media consumption being a thing that could be addictive used in media. It's not something I've come across a huge amount, but Infinite Jest, yeah, it does it.
I quite like the example in Cyberpunk Edge Runners. They've got a couple of different examples of addictive behavior that I quite like. I thought it was interestingly done anyway. So they've got, first of all, the cyberpunks themselves getting these body modifications that give them enhanced abilities, and but they want more and they want more, and they keep updating themselves. But the more they do, the more this technology corrupts their minds, and they've got this cyber psychosis, so where people have just got too much technology built into them, and they have to take increasing suppressive drugs to try and keep themselves sane and stop themselves rejecting these things. And so the main character's arc is going through this, seeing this happen to their mentor figure, and yet still ending up in this cycle. And they also have the example in it as well of these it's like definitely like not for kids, this show, and so they have the example of these videos that you can watch, and where you're seeing the perspective of someone who's literally been killed by the police, for example, and people watch these to get the adrenaline and the high of doing that. And so you've even got characters who are specifically known for their remixing of these videos and things like that, and people get addicted and pay huge amounts of money to watch these things. So there's these two like very different lenses of looking at this in this one series. I thought it was really interesting. Sorry, my
Yeah,
cat.
I think Strange Days as the movie did that as well. A movie that
Yeah.
I've had a visceral hatred towards because of what it made me feel. I just it was just all completely overwhelming when I first saw it, the first time I saw it. But yeah, that it does that, yeah, for sure. Except that you experience the events directly, right? So it's quite a grim. It's grim dark sci-fi for sure. I think so. I recently read The Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor, and there's a drug in that called Isdamil, I think, which it's a world on teetering on the kind of the end of the climate disaster kind of roadway, if you like, motorway, highway, and in this food for most people has lost all its kind of actual taste. Because it's grown in, it's grown in ways that means that a lot of the things that give tomatoes their taste are no longer present. So you have the thing in the shape of a tomato and it provides some of the nutrition, but it doesn't taste nice anymore. It's just bland and grey, like ash in your mouth. And one of the main characters there takes a drug called Isdamil, and the whole point of Isdamil is it makes it means that you don't mind eating food, because the food is so terrible that particularly this character who's a food addict. He's actually a food addict. He all he wants to do is eat the last. He would eat the last tuna on earth if he could, because it would taste nice. And so that's his. He's kind of totally lost himself in this sense of my meaning is I've got to eat nice food for life to have any meaning. I've got to feel these sensations, otherwise life is empty. So he takes this drug to suppress those feelings and allow him to eat rubbish food all day long in order so that he doesn't starve to death, because he just won't, when he's not on it, he won't eat food because he hates the taste of it. And I think it's a really interesting, like it's set kind of 30, 40, maybe 100 years from now, but it's a really interesting, I think there's a whole bunch of kind of, they're not recreational, right? They're functional drugs that people will take to deal with situations like that. And you only have to look at the opioid crisis in the States to kind of think about how people take functional drugs in the wrong way, if there's a wrong way to take them, that leaves them kind of stranded and high and dry because they were taking them for a specific reason, but none of the other reasons in their lives that might have kind of intersected to say this is not the right thing for you to be doing were considered. And this is a great example of one of those types of drugs. And I think we, like, to be glum about it, I think we'll see loads of those as people become more able to do designer pharmaceuticals over the next kind of 20, 30, 40 years, as it becomes anybody with the right printer will be able to do it. I think that is absolutely the type of thing, we'll see. I don't think we see enough of that in fiction right now. We see it as a piece of world building in sci-fi, but we don't see people exploring the consequences of that at the moment. At least I'm not aware. I'd happily take recommendations from people to go away and read on that.
Is that kind of mundane? Yeah, that mundane use of things like that. That's never. I mean, obviously, people always say that about science fiction. That kind of all the myriad things that people thought you'd use technology for. Sending pictures of your cat around the world was never considered one. But similarly, that kind of very mundane use of drugs and pharmaceuticals to do these very mundane things. That kind of, and in fact, of course, the real life big drug at the moment is the drug that's just the opposite, that makes you not want to eat, and that, of course, is supposedly to be used to tackle severe obesity, but is used by a lot of people who certainly do not need to stop eating. So it's the opposite of what you're talking about, the artificial drug you're talking about, but that kind of very, very tediously mundane daily life substances that will have vast consequences, but not in those kind of really big noticeable ways. That kind of would be something interesting that, it's just not particularly interesting to write about in quite the same way. Some of these,
I think it's really thoughtful, and I think you can make good. I believe you can make good stories out of it. But I think what it brings us to is something I was thinking about when we were talking about the premise for the panel. Is like there's a whole bunch of drugs out there that can harm us if used in the wrong way, and a lot of them are legal because they're when used in the right way, they can deliver profound goods. And I think that's really interesting, right? Drugs that are developed for a specific, quite narrow reason that have all sorts of impacts when used at an angle to the reason that they were created. And Jenni, I'm sure you've seen loads of this, with people coming in using stuff that they should probably not be using. Right?
I mean, the classic is the opioid crisis in the States. You know, opioids are a fantastic drug in their place. So pain is a horrible, horrible thing. And some people are in so much pain on a daily basis that they cannot function. And giving them a painkiller, as much as it might knock you out and things like that, it gets you where you need to be to do what you need to do. Like if you're a mum who can't pick up her kid because you've got terrible, terrible back pain, you're going to do what it takes to kind of get to where you need to be. But I think that's one of the big things about a lot of these fantasy drugs when people write about them, is actually, have they actually thought about what would drive people to use it in the first place? Because if you've not explored that properly, you don't really fully understand it. And there's often a reason that people go down this path. The difficulty is that, you know, as a prescriber, I have a moral responsibility to be careful about this, because I know that a lot of people will do what they need to do to get through the day. And whether that's, you know, so if I'm giving out a strong painkiller, I have a duty to safeguard these people who I'm prescribing it to, because if I just gave out morphine or diazepam or gabapentin willy-nilly, like chaos would reign, and there would be so many people who would be addicted. And in fact, in the days before we understood this properly, people were a lot less careful about it, and we're still reaping the consequences of that down the line. And in America, they had a financial interest in pushing things like oxycodone to people, and now there's all of these absolutely miserable people who are addicted to it because they took it because they thought that was the only thing that could deal with their pain, and now they're stuck. So there are all of these drugs, and that doesn't mean they're bad drugs. It just means that they were used badly, and it's not necessarily the people who started them. It's not their fault necessarily. They did what the doctor told them to do, or the prescriber told them to do, and actually it wasn't. You know, that someone needs to take some responsibility here. And so I have a big bone to pick with a lot of these big pharmaceutical companies who've pushed it in these different ways. Yeah, so there's always going to be something that pushes someone to do something. You know, no one's going to say, I'm going to go out and get addicted to heroin today. You know, there is always a reason that someone's ended up in that situation. And there's the theory of the addicted personality, but actually there's a lot of factors that lead into it. And you know, often we also talk about poor decision making ability, especially when you're younger. So under the age of 25, your risk assessment abilities are not as good. So we know that those people are in increased risk, and people who come from difficult environments, or there's lots of drug use around you, so it's normalized. That makes it harder to say no. Peer pressure is a really powerful thing. And you know, also situations like if you're in a difficult place and you have a dopamine starved brain, your brain, there is some evidence to suggest that you will go seeking out dopamine rewarding behaviors. So if you're in a situation, you're more likely to find your way to these dopamine hits that then become addictive. So not everyone, like some people will try a drug and not become addicted, but some people will, and it's those people that we worry about. So there are lots of good drugs out there that have lots of problems. We actually still give heroin in certain cases in medicine. So, but we don't call it that anymore because we don't want to. So, for example, in labour, we sometimes use diamorph because labour hurts, surprisingly enough. So, and we give diamorph, and it works really, really well in that one singular context. And one injection often isn't enough to cause addiction, but you know, we're super careful about who gets to get that and things like that as well. So, you know, even heroin in its place is usable. There are so many side effects to a lot of these things that you've got to bear in mind.
Thank you, Jenni, and thank you for the discussion that took us in that direction. Now, I think we're probably in a place where we should do a bit of Q&A if there is any, and I see one question here from Gabe, which is, any thoughts on social media addiction? I think there are studies that suggest it's actually human interaction rather than the technology that enables it.
There's some good science fiction books out there on this. The one I can remember most recently is Face by Jonah West, where everything is based on your face, your social media sort of presence. So it's turned up it's popularity contest basically. So everyone is focused in completely on how good they look in relation to everyone else. I think there's a little bit of there's that Black Mirror episode, which I can't remember the name of for the life of me, where you get ratings out of 5 for everything. It's and so to the point where it's everyone's entire life is based on their rating. Meow Meow Beans in Community is the satire of yeah, that's exactly right. I have a feeling there's others that I haven't read. The one that's popped up most recently is Adam Roberts's This, I think it's called, which I haven't read. So, but someone here might be able to count for that. And then, of course, you know, I can advertise my own book. Glitterati by Oliver K. Langmead has a lot to say about addictions to fashion and social media presence and being the best looking person in the room. Check it out.
It does.
Look at that blue foil. Ooh,
very pretty. In fact, it's fabulous, as we've discussed before. Good. The only thing that occurs to me is maybe not directly related, or maybe it is, but there was did a little bit of research into this, not a huge amount, but I caused to for something that I was writing. The perception, shall I say, that you know, technology and social media use and phones, etc., is resulting in a shortening of attention span in humans. And where I ended up with that was an article that explained that there's this Canadian study that proves the point, but and everyone else has referenced back to that, but the Canadian study is actually fictitious. And so, and allegedly, or as of about 18 months ago, there was no scientific proof that.
Yeah, I was going to say, as far as I'm aware, there is no proof of this. In fact, the studies that I've seen show that.
Good. I'm glad I didn't imagine that. But so in relation to addiction to social media, whilst I'll admit to being as guilty as the average person in the street, I don't know about being keen to get rid of all those little red circles at the top of my apps. Does that mean I'm addicted? Does that mean I'm obsessive? I don't know what that means, but it's hard to imagine it doesn't have some kind of impact. It probably certainly steals time away from other things that might be more socially valuable, really. I don't know, or is it?
I don't know if people do those more socially valuable things, or if they ever did them, if you see what I mean.
Yes, yeah. Is it
I
again?
think it's an idea that we have about ourselves that in reality doesn't happen. Because so the way I think about these sorts of things like this and is that it's part of my brain. It's my portable brain, right? And in that sense, you know, we had this conversation at EasterCon where I you know, my view is that we have been cybernetic since we kind of had printing presses and pens and tools and hammers. Right, the moment we started developing tools, we became cybernetic people, right? Because our agency became externally crystallized in tools. And so are we post-human? We're kind of post-human, but I'm still quite obviously here. But I've also need this to function in the society I'm in. Right. So I'm absolutely a cybernetic organism. It's just that we don't think about it like that. We think about this as something that's not part of our identity. And I think part of the discussion, for me at least, part of the discussion about am I addicted to this, is that, well, no, I'm not addicted to it. It's part of who I am. Now you might kind of say, well, that means you're addicted. I'm like, no, it's more existential than that. It's more fundamental to my nature. Now I can put this down and go and live in the countryside, but at that very point, I'm living a different life. I'm becoming a different person. I think often it's a category error in how we think about how we interact with each other socially that leads us to see our phones and other things as a crutch rather than integral to kind of the types of lives lives we now lead. But having said that, I think science, kind of going back a little bit, science fiction kind of tends to skip over the phone as an addiction, as social media as an addiction. Certainly in long form, I think there are a decent number of shorter form stories that kind of explore this, partly because it's a little bit one note, but also because I think a lot of this is thinking about, it thinks about singularity and transhumanism. So you end up with like Don DeLillo 0K, where his mother has uploaded herself, and in order for him to go and have a conversation, he has to go and persuade his mother to talk to him because her consciousness is on a computer and she's not interested. She's having a fantastic time living on a computer, living in her computer, right? And I think, and Emma Newman has done some stuff around this as well in her books. And I think that's like, we jump to the end, right? Science fiction jumps to the end. It doesn't necessarily, or it doesn't think about the journey, if there is a journey, right? Do we think uploading the brain is likely? No, I don't. But people do kind of conceptually jump to the thought experiments, like logical, like absurdity, which is we're all in the computer now. We're not just carrying phones around.
Well, there's that. I mean,
sorry,
Jenny, I feel so. I've done this to you before, so you speak.
No, I'm just going to say, following on from what she said. We're so reliant on phones these days as an extension, like a personal assistant, but this kind of thing, that actually there's some evidence that has come out that suggests that it's changed the way that we think, and the way that we organize information in our brains. So, and there's evidence that, since the advent of computers, that younger people tend to remember and organize how to find information. So they've got a locational way, and they often think of it in more of a file system. Whereas people who are, who grew up pre-computers or didn't have that as a strong part of their development when they were younger, think about things in very different ways. So there is an evidence that we are adjusting to having this technology in our society, and we are organizing our own brains around it. Which I think is always just a really interesting concept, is how do we change technology, but how does it change us? And there is evidence already that is happening. The other thing is that obviously social media companies are very good at making things as addictive as possible. So whether you have an addiction or not to it, everyone gets that dopamine hit when they do certain things, such as they clear their notifications, and then someone interacts with them and they get a notification and they become more popular. The whole algorithms that they design are designed to give you these dopamine hits and make you come back. So this isn't they are deliberately trying to make you addicted to the app so you use it. So this is very much an intentional thing by social media. Whether it's, I don't know what my point was there. I've completely lost it. I'm sorry. Anna, please go.
I was actually going to take up what Stu was saying. So what I'm immediately thinking, what I actually weirdly think about quite a lot is the stuff at the end of WALL-E, where they're all, which is a film I have seen a billion times because my son was addicted to it, so it is something that comes in my head a lot. But when they're on the ship, these sort of very large, very unfit people on these sort of floating chairs communicating with each other via screens. So there's a scene where two people are next to each other, but they're talking to each other they're looking at a screen, talking to each other, not actually talking to each other face to face. And of course, the assumption is that is inherently bad, to not be physically healthy, to have a body which is designed to lie in a chair rather than to walk around is inherently bad. And to talk to someone via a screen rather than face to face is inherently bad. But of course, why is that inherently bad? What kind of, yes, someone can give me some big lecture on the cardiovascular effects of being overweight, but this notion that it is inherently bad to be living your life sitting down, experiencing the world through a screen, and that somehow, no matter how happy these people are doing this, and no matter how no matter that the society appears to be functioning, this is really bad, and they've got to get back down to earth and go back to living as thin, muscular people who talk face to face, because that's inherently better. I mean, why shouldn't they? In fact, they have a much more inclusive society in many ways than a society in which being physically strong because you're in a kind of society where you're going to, you don't have medical treatment, or a society where, they're not fascist, they don't have issues about attractiveness, they don't have issues about disability. They seem to be in some ways a great society, and they all seem very happy. But it must be morally bad because their lives are being entirely mediated by technology, rather than their lives seem really good because they're mediated by technology.
And that was going to be my slight contribution. We talk about social media as and devices as a bad thing, and I think that often the commonly cited example is two people sitting in a restaurant across from each other looking at their phones. But I don't know, I think there's obviously something else going on there in terms of the phone as defense mechanism, or phone as filter and protective armor, or whatever it is, and I think it's too easy to say that the phone's arguably not at fault there, of course, which as Stu says, they're a lot of people will curse them, but how well would we function without them in the way that we live our lives? Yeah, I'd have to go along with that. So I trust that we answered Gabe's question there. Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? I don't see any more. Gabe seems to be happy. Good. Well, I think we're probably drawing things to a close, and so maybe we could leave it with perhaps just one example. If you would like to send the listeners and the viewers away with a book to read that in which this subject features in an important way, perhaps each of us could give an example. Take any volunteers volunteer that wishes to go first, or I will to give you a chance to think about it, and by all means recommend your own book. I have no scruples about that if you wish to do that. And I'm afraid I'm going to probably quite repetitively suggest that folks go and check out the first John Nyquist book, which, oh gosh, I hope I'm going to get this right. It's A Man of Shadows, I think is the first one.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you, Stu. I just think if you're in the market for something like nothing you've read before, if you haven't read Jeff Noon before, I would recommend that.
I recommend Embassy Town by China Mieville. It's if you want a book that's going to wrinkle your brain, that'll do it.
I think we should all want that, Ollie. So excellent. And mysteriously, that doesn't appear to be the cover of Embassy Town, but that's okay, because I would recommend that too.
I would recommend Guards by Terry Pratchett. Sam Vimes is an alcoholic, and the book starts with him in his lowest place, and he goes on a journey. And I think it's not often talked about that Vimes is an alcoholic. Like it's one of those, again, it's one of those stories where it's you don't take it seriously because it's not presented in a way to take it seriously. But I think it's a really interesting take on a man finding hope, and the reason he was doing his drug was because he was hopeless and he was looking for a way to feel good.
Thank you, Stu. Yes, and I think in a slightly unassuming way, Mr. Pratchett has probably taught us a lot about a lot of things that we weren't necessarily expecting when we picked the book up. Anna or Jenny, care to?
I'm panicking because Stu's already said my option, so
I'm sorry.
Looking at myself, being like, "Is there anything else here?"
There's another 40 Pratchett books. Just pick
any Pratchett book is fine. Yes.
For anyone that hasn't, yeah.
Come back to me.
Anna, I saw you with a book in your hand then.
I was just copying Ollie and waving my own book around.
Please do.
They can appear at once.
Please do. And I have my copy ready to get started on soon. So
Gosh, I mean, oh, I couldn't say.
So it's not mandatory. It's not mandatory. Please don't feel that you have to think of an answer. That's quite all right. So unless Jenny wants to pitch anything after Stu callously stole her example, then I think we are probably at the end. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Anna Smith-Spark. Thank you, Jenni Coutts. Thank you, Oliver K. Langmead. And thank you, Stuart Hotston, I beg your pardon. That was really interesting. I have a little bit of housekeeping here, if you will. So please do share the Zoom link for the panel when it comes out. We have some cool Glasgow 2024 merch available on Redbubble. redbubble.com/people/Glasgow 2024/shop, which may be shared in the chat, the link to that. Events coming up. Glasgow 2024 has a fan table at NASFIT Pemicon in Winnipeg, and also will be present at FancyCon in Birmingham this September. I think it's the 15th to 17th, I believe. Hope to see you there. And yeah, just the usual, keep an eye on Glasgow 2024 socials for future events, exciting announcements and the like. And so there, last point, do volunteer if you are interested in getting involved in a Worldcon. I have never been involved in a Worldcon before, and it has been an amazing experience so far, and there's still over a year to go. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to get in touch via the Glasgow 2024 website and find out about the exciting opportunities available. So there we go. I hope everyone enjoyed the panel, and thank you for joining us. Good evening.